Thank you first off for coming here tonight. You could have been anywhere else enjoying the beautiful weather outside, but you decided to come here and learn more about how you can advance your capacity through fiscal sponsorship here in Baltimore. And so I'm going to just do a couple of quick housekeeping things to let you know how tonight's session is going to go. As you can see, this is not a typical Zoom meeting. It's a webinar, which means you are not on camera, but you will be allowed to participate throughout this evening's discussion. And so I'm just going to give you a couple quick tips on how to make sure we can see your questions and ensure that we are answering all of your concerns and anything you may be thinking while tonight's presentation is going on. If you notice at the bottom of your screen, you see a raise hand feature. What that allows me to do is when I see if you have a question during tonight's presentation, you'll be able to raise your hand and I can unmute your mic and you can actually speak to the presenter, who is Ms. Dorcas Gilmore, for tonight's presentation and seminar. And so when you speak, you can actually speak out your question and ask anything that's specific. And it means that we can actually hear you as you're talking, so you don't have to type it into the chat box. Another thing I want to make you aware of is the Q&A section. At the bottom of your screen, where you see the mute button and all that stuff, you also see a Q&A button. And the Q&A button, what that allows you to do is actually type your question into a screen where we can see who has unanswered questions. The chat box is just more for general engagement and any comments you may have. But if you have a specific question, I encourage you to use the Q&A feature and not the chat box, because the Q&A feature allows me to see questions that are open that have not been answered, as opposed to the chat box where that feature isn't there. And so again, if you have questions tonight, just click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom window and type in any questions you may have. Ms. Gilmore will be taking questions at the end of the presentation, and it will also be a group activity at the end, and we'll give instructions for that as well. One more thing, we want to make sure that this is useful. So at the end of tonight's seminar, we're going to send you a link that we want you to fill out to tell us if you thought this was useful, because part of the Baltimore Children and Youth Fund's mission is to ensure that the work that we're doing is actually useful to Black organizations and just community organizations in general here in Baltimore. And so if you have any feedback, if good or bad, please feel free to share it with us at the end of tonight's seminar. So I will get out of the way and kick it over to Ms. Dorcas Gilmore, who will be giving us the rundown on tonight's session. And I hope you enjoy it, get a lot out of it, and thank you. Appreciate you for being here.
Thanks, Adam. Good evening, everyone. And once again, welcome to the session that is going to build on the last session that was focused on fiscal sponsorship and the landscape and ecosystem of fiscal sponsorship in Baltimore. Tonight, we're going to continue the discussion of fiscal sponsorship as an important tool to really support the work of grassroots organizations and as an important community development tool to strengthen communities. What we will focus on tonight is really how fiscal sponsorship is appropriate in certain circumstances and not appropriate in others. How we should think about what it means to be in a fiscal sponsor relationship, and what are some of the do's and don'ts that will help to navigate the relationship and make sure that it really advances the goals of grassroots organizations. So next slide, Adam. Our specific goals tonight are 4 points. We really want to be able to answer some of the questions that came out of the first session. And through that, to address the framework for fiscal sponsorship, the different models of fiscal sponsorship, the differences between fiscal sponsorship and fiscal agency, to highlight some of the best practices of starting, being in, and ending fiscal sponsorship relationships, and then to provide a framework for some key questions to ask at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end of fiscal sponsorship relationships. So those are our goals tonight. And of course, to answer as many questions as possible, as Adam indicated, we will spend the first hour having some presentation and some conversation around fiscal sponsorship. The second hour will be devoted to small groups, 2 small groups, where we will be specifically focused on the beginning and ending of a fiscal sponsorship relationship in one group, and the how to have a strong fiscal sponsorship relationship while you are in the fiscal sponsor relationship. So we will divide into two groups, and we will end tonight in those two groups, answering questions and talking about best practices and lessons learned. Next slide, please. So we have a great group of folks tonight. We're excited, and we will be going more on the definitions, on the requirements, and on how to make sure that the relationship is structured in a way that really achieves what organizations are trying to achieve in their programs. I will be joined by Becky Witt from the Community Law Center, and Becky will be joining us in a small group section and will be a part of continuing to build programming on this subject for um, grassroots organizations as well as fiscal sponsors around the legal requirements. Kristen Allen, who is the vice chair of the BCYF board, as well as a technical assistance provider, principal of Brazen Consulting and Accounting, and has been a business and strategy consultant with philanthropy and grassroots organizations in the city for over 10 years. My colleagues will also be joining us to answer questions and think about legal issues. My partner, Parag Kandar, and Barbara Bezdek will be providing additional support in the small group session and in this presentation to talk about legal issues and benefits and challenges in the fiscal sponsorship relationship. So we have a full agenda tonight, and are excited about the opportunity to really go a little bit deeper on some of the questions that you all uplifted in our last session. Next slide. So we've done our overview. I skipped ahead a little bit. Sorry about that. Um, Next slide. So we want to just start with the why of this again. Why BCYF is having a program focused on fiscal sponsorship. And it really is that supporting grassroots organizations and thinking about how to ensure that the programs that are needed in our communities, and that the resources that it takes to carry out those programs are stewarded well and actually benefit our children, and our communities. And a key part of that, as we know, is the fiscal sponsorship relationship that enables grassroots organizations to be able to focus on the heart of the matter and making sure that the programming and the work that is being done in our communities is what our children need. And so, this as a crucial tool, when used well to advance that mission, is central to what the Baltimore Children and Youth Fund's mission is. So we will continue to have programming focused on fiscal sponsorship and highlighting the need for other funders, as well as building an ecosystem for fiscal, continuing to build an ecosystem for fiscal sponsorship in the city. Next slide. So one of the key questions that came up in the last session was, what does it mean to be a fiscal sponsor? And there was a good amount of conversation around the differences between a fiscal sponsorship relationship and a fiscal agency relationship. So just to review that a little bit, that a fiscal sponsor relationship, which can take traditionally thought of as six different forms, and we'll talk a little bit about those forms as we move forward. But that the fiscal sponsorship relationship really thinks about who is in control of some key elements. And fiduciary responsibilities is a key piece here. So, in the fiscal sponsorship relationship, the fiscal sponsor is the fiduciary, is the legally responsible party for, depending upon the model, but for this, I'm going to talk about a comprehensive fiscal sponsorship or a Model A fiscal sponsorship. They're responsible for making sure that all of the pieces of the program are handled in the way that they were set out to be handled in the grant agreement, and that they're responsible for all of the compliance aspects of that. So the taxes, the filing of reports with grantors, they're responsible for all of the elements are um, that are a part of receiving the funds. The fiscal sponsor is also in control of a number of things, as opposed to the fiscal agency relationship, where it's really the reverse. An agency relationship, lawyers are agents, for example. An agency relationship is that the agent is doing what the principal says. So I have a client as a lawyer. The client tells me what they want. They tell me how they want me to do it, and they tell me what the ultimate goals are. So in a fiscal agency relationship, it really is not completely the opposite, but very close to the opposite of a fiscal sponsor relationship. The fiscal sponsor has to ensure that there is alignment with its mission and that the project and the fiscal sponsor are aligned in terms of the sponsor's mission, and that the work of the organization must further the tax exempt purposes of the fiscal sponsor. On the other side of the coin, the fiscally sponsored project is usually responsible for the programmatic vision, the strategy of the work, and being connected to a fiscal sponsor also places some limitation on the activities of the fiscally sponsored project. Those are a part of what should be discussed and negotiated with the fiscal sponsor. The fiscal sponsor relationship, when it is at its best, is also building the capacity of the fiscally sponsored project. So, with those general frameworks, we'll build upon to talk about models of fiscal sponsorship and how to have greater control um, in areas of fiduciary responsibility, legal responsibility, strategic responsibility, and programmatic responsibility. Okay, next slide. Okay, and just to highlight some of the benefits of the fiscal sponsorship relationship are really to the sponsor. There's alignment, there's the ability to have broader impact. Um, for uh, some fiscal sponsor organizations, this is also a revenue stream that has been developed. For the project, and again, a complete fiscal sponsorship relationship, there additional, in addition to the 501c3 status, technical assistance, support with human resources, so employees, and all of the insurances, payroll, accounting, as well as general insurance coverage for the project. And then benefits to the donors and to the public, I would say. So tax deductions and greater support and infrastructure for grassroots organizations. I will pause there and see if there are any questions. And then we will move from this as the general framework to really having a conversation with Kirsten around her experiences as a fiscal sponsor, her experience supporting fiscally sponsored projects, um, and go a little bit deeper into what are some of the issues that arise, and how to address them.
Okay, while Dorcas is pausing for questions, I want to remind people, if you want to ask a question, you can, if you want to speak into the mic and say what your question is or give a comment, just hit the raise your hand function on the bottom of your screen. You'll see it next to the mute button and all those buttons at the bottom of the screen. Just click on raise your hand and I'll be able to unmute you. You can speak your question, or you can just click on Q&A and type in your question in the box so we can keep track of all the things you've asked this evening. We'll wait for a few seconds, see if anyone wants to raise their hand or type in a question, and then we'll move on to the next part of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I always count to 30. So I hit the 30 mark, so I haven't seen any questions. So I'll move to
There's a
the,
question in the Q&A.
oh, there is.
Yep.
Right.
You see it, Dorcas?
I'm not seeing it. No.
I can just read it out loud.
That'd be great.
I apologize if I pronounce your name wrong. Dinora Olmos. Her question is, I'm a little confused. So is it better to have a fiscal agent?
So a fiscal agency, the answer to that is it depends on what you are trying to do. So a fiscal agency is a relationship that usually happens when you have a larger organization, and what you're trying to do is actually get support from another organization with your bookkeeping or with your accounting, or with your um, okay, all right, so we'll build on this answer. And so the fiscal agency relationship is really you hiring someone to support you in a particular way with your financial record keeping, your financial reporting, etc. The fiscal sponsor relationship is a relationship that at base is you wanting support through a tax deduction and a tax exempt C3 organization, such that the C3 organization then serves as really the wraparound support for your organization. In a comprehensive fiscal sponsorship relationship, which is what most grassroots organizations have, the fiscal sponsor is really your organizational home. The fiscally sponsored organization is effectively a project or a program of the fiscal sponsor. So the fiscal sponsor is providing insurance. The fiscal sponsor is providing payroll. All employees are hired by the fiscal sponsor. And as a part of that fiscal sponsorship relationship, any donations that are given to the program, the fiscally sponsored program, are tax deductible donations. The fiscal sponsor is responsible for sending out the thank you letter that says, thank you for giving your donation. The fiscal sponsor is responsible for taxes and accounting related to any sale of goods, for example, if you have any merchandise that's being sold. So normally a grassroots organization is looking for a fiscal sponsor relationship. And in that relationship, there is responsibility for all of the aspects of finances, and legal responsibility usually sits then with the fiscal sponsor. And fiscal agency is really just hiring someone to carry out some financial tasks.
So we also have another question from Mr. Paulo Gregory. It states, I started a little late. If this was answered, feel free to move on. But wondering, what are the limitations in the relationship of a fiscally sponsored for-profit organization?
Okay. Hey, Paulo. So we are, if you could hold that question, we will be coming to that shortly. So you didn't miss it.
All right, and I think Parag is actually answering a question from Ms. Renee Stanford, saying, will that service or relationship be list or paid as indirect costs? But it looks like Parag is answering that question in the Q&A box. So we can move forward to the next part, Dorcas.
Okay, great. So now we'll move into a conversation with Kristen that really is about your experience as both a fiscal sponsor and as someone who has supported fiscally sponsored projects in a range of ways. And so the first question is if you could just talk to us a little bit more about your role as a fiscal sponsor and as a technical assistance provider so that we have a sense of your experience in both roles.
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dorcas, for the previous introduction. My name is Kirsten Allen, and I do serve as Vice Chair for Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund. I have been able to have a varied experience throughout my history of my philanthropic efforts through my own organization, which I founded. It's called Meraki Community Uplift. And although I haven't served as a fiscal agent for numerous organizations, our organization has been able to stand in the gap for some smaller organizations that may not have their 501c3 status, that are looking to get funding for a project or an initiative. I still am a fiscal sponsor for another organization. And although they don't have consistent engagement, whenever there is a need to assume funds from a funder or a fundraising point of view, we serve as that agent for them to do so. It has been definitely a unique experience that I don't think I was prepared for. A lot of times with these efforts, somebody comes to you with a need and you do your best to assume that role and fill in the gap of the need that is there. I can't say we had my partner, who is the treasurer for the organization, but also my partner in my consultant agency who does the accounting portion. She was really clutch in us being able to fall and fill in the gap for this organization that had a need, that they needed to receive funds, but they weren't able to because they didn't have that 501c3 status. So we were approached, they were connected to us. We were approached. We didn't even have necessarily a process within our organization for how to onboard or what the conversation looked like or should look like for somebody trying to assume this role within our organization. But we were able to, because we were so aligned with our missions and values and what we were trying to do for community, the conversation blossomed and we were able to make something work. Would I recommend going that route? No, because it doesn't always work like that. But that was just my personal experience in that instance. As far as being a technical assistance provider for fiscally sponsored organizations, it is a very it can be a challenging relationship to help liaise between the two or support the two, because every fiscal sponsor has different requirements. Everyone has different processes of how they onboard or what they expect from organizations that fall under their organization. So you have to be familiar with what this organization requires, what they're looking for, what their expectations are. And it can be somewhat confusing if there isn't that transparency there, or if it just isn't laid out and there isn't that ground setting to inform that organization being sponsored, to let them know this is what the expectations are. So when someone else comes in as a third party and is trying to help and provide that support, that they also know how to best serve and help that organization. So my experience has been varied. This is a very important and timely conversation, especially now and today, because we have so many organizations that need the resource that fiscal sponsorship provides. But it's even more important today for us to create a strategic narrative around how this tool can be utilized and how it can be utilized effectively for both relationships, for the fiscal sponsor and the organization that's being sponsored.
Thanks. Yeah, you hit on a number of really key issues. And wanted to also, you've uplifted a couple of pieces that are potential cautions. And so if you could go a little bit deeper on what are some of the cautions that you would have for fiscally sponsored projects and for fiscal sponsors entering into the relationship.
Yeah, so I mean, again, I'm going based off my experience, but if I had to name just a couple things, it's like 5 R's that were top of mind for me, which includes reputation. So, what is the reputation of both organizations? Like, it's important both ways. What's the reputation of the organization that you're trying to come under to assume, to to assume and okay, so y'all, to I'm sorry, y'all, my son is leaving. To assume this role and be able to accept funds on their behalf. And also, what's the reputation of the organization that is ultimately going to be a reflection of you? The other is rate. It's really important for that to be transparent from the very beginning. What is the rate that Dorcas mentioned that some fiscal sponsors utilize this resource as a funding stream? And that's a real thing, right? Like, don't think like nonprofit isn't a business. It ultimately is a business and needs to run and function a certain way. And that you have to those expense those expenses are very important. So what is the rate that this person is ultimately charging you for the service of keeping up with their fiduciary responsibilities, assuming the role as accepting your funds and having to have the staff and capacity to be able to do so? What is that rate, and is it clear and transparent in the very beginning? Also, roles, like what is your role versus my role? What is your responsibility versus my responsibility? Who's doing the reporting? And some fiscal sponsors, most grants require some level of reporting. That will be the responsibility of the organization being sponsored. But some fiscal sponsors also require a level of reporting. So what does that look like for you? What does that mean for the capacity of your organization? And how does that impact how you're able to function? Because what happens a lot of time is many of the organizations that are looking for fiscal sponsorship are your smaller grassroots organizations that don't necessarily want the responsibility of everything that comes with assuming a 501c3 status, or just aren't looking to build past a certain capacity. So they have a specific mission in mind, at least at that point, until they have the desire to grow into something different. And they are looking for someone who aligns with them, aligns with their practices, their programming, in order to assume these funds for them. So it's really important, especially for the onboarded organization to understand what is required and what kind of impact is that going to have for your organization, understanding that a lot of these grassroots organizations, although do awesome work, they are doing great things on a shoestring budget or no budget at all.
So thanks. That was really helpful. So the 5 R's in particular, and if as you think about the relationship that you developed over time with your fiscally sponsored project when you were a fiscal sponsor or a fiscal sponsor, what would you recommend for fiscal sponsors to really emphasize and think about at the beginning of the relationship, particularly as you talked about transparent communication?
Absolutely. So, a lot of you don't know unless you know. And a lot of times, at least from my experience, I learned by doing. And if I had to do it all over again, or if I had the opportunity um, to be that resource for another organization, I really have to look within my organization and just like ask myself a couple questions. What infrastructure do I have in place for my own organization? What kind of QuickBooks do we use? What kind of payroll am I going to support? What kind of auditing or reporting that in turn will translate over to that organization that's onboarding under me? Can it be actually expanded in support for others? Am I struggling within my own organization? Like, what does that look like for us? And what does that look like for somebody else to come under me? What kind of framework do I have in place, especially for my finances? Because that's one of the main components of being a fiscal sponsor. What do your finances look like, and how are you being responsible with minding and taking care of them? And just really knowing your organizational limits. I think this conversation has come up, although it has been like an underground conversation for some time, it has now come above ground because of many issues that have taken place historically with either there not being enough transparency between the relationship, or just organizations not knowing when to say, no, you know what, we're at capacity, or we need to build this a little bit better, or we need to think about this a little different before we onboard and trying to bring in other organizations. Um, uh, uh, Although intentions are a lot of times well, you have to really think, am I doing more harm than I am helping? Because if I'm not in a place to onboard or bring in someone under my organization to support them, am I doing them more help than harm? What is the reputation that I may unintentionally give them with their funders because certain things as far as reporting or providing monthly financial statements that can impact that organization and their relationships that they are trying to build, which will limit their capacity and ability to grow in essence. So you really need to think at the inception of this relationship, where am I as an organization, and can I really be the resource that this other organization needs for me to be? What are the current needs for organizations today? Is it just that I need to acquire funds for them so that they can continue with their programming? Is it a capacity building thing? Because for my personal relationship with my fiscal sponsor, they weren't looking, or at least they knew coming in that my small grassroots organization did not have the capacity to do much of the capacity building that they may need in order for them to be on the right track for their 501c3. So although we may be able to have a relationship where I'm able to give advice and give tips, but the personal and like professional development element, providing that one-on-one technical assistance or providing those check-ins where I can say, this is something I think you should do different based on my experience. I personally didn't have the capacity to do that, but I let that organization know at the inception of our relationship that this is what it would look like. So that's where that transparency piece also comes into important play. And then if I'm an organization, I'm looking at what are the lessons. There aren't many large scale fiscal sponsors in Baltimore City, but there are enough that we can look at and look at those lessons and say, this is what occurred because of XYZ. How can I, as an organization, not make those same mistakes and be a support to the organizations that are coming to me for this resource? I also think it's important to understand, like, everybody's not coming to you for this resource because they're at a deficit or out of desperation. Some people understand clearly what they need and what they want, and it is just not to have the administrative burden of having a 501c3. So to have the understanding and openness to say, this is my equal, this is my partner, this is my counterpart, which is really across the board, but understanding, like, not everybody is in a place of my hair's on fire, let me go to ask this organization, can they assume this role for me because I'm in a place of deficit. And the last thing I would say is, what organization do you want to be a reflection of you? It is very important at the inception of that relationship that you know, and it's some things you'll be able to control, and it's some things you won't. But at the very beginning of it, you all's missions and values and how you operate and how you approach and how you show up in community are very similar. Because if those things aren't aligned, it doesn't matter what kind of reporting that organization does. It doesn't matter who the head of it is, who your CFO is, who that program manager is. If those just fundamental elements are not aligned for your organizations, you all cannot be positive reflections of each other.
Thank you for that, Kristen. That was excellent. And so many important points around particularly the reputation piece and the alignment of mission. There were a couple of points that I got. If you could repeat the 5 R's, that would be great. So
The
you
5
said
R's:
reputation.
reputation, rate, roles, responsibilities, and reporting.
Thank you. All right. And in those 5 roles, what have you seen as the possibility of fiscal sponsorship to really work well for grassroots organizations?
I mean, I hate to like harp on the same notes, but just transparency and understanding at the very beginning. I can't stress enough how important that conversation is. If you are an organization looking to be a fiscal sponsor, to make sure you have those things in place, to make sure you have it in writing, to make sure you are able to present something to an organization that is coming to you for a resource that you can provide, and that those conversations are able to happen early. So if I had to, if I had to say anything about just working relation, and then the communication, like, there has to be capacity for communication. If I'm not saying that you have to be available 24 hours a day, but that organization that's looking to be sponsored, they have a certain level of need. And if you do not have the capacity to be able to be available to meet that need that has been expressed, then you're ultimately doing that organization a disservice. If you do not have the capacity to be able to report out on financials in a timely fashion, you are doing a disservice to that organization. Because just like you as a fiscally sponsoring organization have responsibilities, So does that grassroots organization. It doesn't matter if it's a $5,000 grant, a $2,500, whatever that grant, there are requirements that are required of that organization that in turn, extend to the fiscally sponsored organization. But that grant maker, that funder is looking at the organization that they funded, that they have built a relationship with, to make sure that those requirements are being met. And if you are not in a position of being capable and ready to be what that organization needs, don't step into that role. Because as we've seen historically, it a small issue can turn into a very large fire. And it doesn't just impact one organization when you are a fiscal sponsor, it impacts all the organizations under you. Not only does it impact all the organizations under you, it impacts everybody they serve. So you really have to think beyond just the organization. Who are they serving? And how is that going to impact the individuals that these organizations are actually serving, the ones who have the essential need that these organizations are providing?
Thank you so much, Kirsten, for that. This was an excellent overview of both what fiscal sponsors need to consider, as well as what fiscally sponsored organizations need to consider. And there's lots of love for the 5 R's, which I think is a really helpful framework for thinking about what should be in writing as we move to the next piece, which is about who's in charge and what are the elements of being in charge. So thank you, Kirsten, for that overview.
Thank you.
We're going to go back to the slides just to hit a couple of points around this. As Kirsten has highlighted, she can go to the next slide. There are some important pieces to really think about in the fiscal sponsorship relationship. What is the role of the fiscal sponsor? Often, the fiscal sponsor and the fiscally sponsored project are using the same words, but meaning different things, and how to really make sure that what um, both organizations are talking about um, is really what happens in the relationship. We've highlighted a number of areas of caution and used the 5 R framework for thinking about opportunity, but also thinking about potential challenges. And then Kirsten has highlighted a number of recommendations for future fiscal sponsors and what it means to be successful in the fiscal sponsorship relationship to advance the work, the reputation, and the capacity of organizations. We could move to the next slide. So, for other pieces, as these things are being written down, and as you're having the conversation as a fiscal sponsor and a fiscally sponsored program or project, is to really think about who's in charge on 4 levels. In terms of the fiduciary responsibilities, which we've talked a good amount about, but fiduciary responsibilities are about the care that is necessary to make sure that the organization is doing its best work. So, all of the things that fall within that. So, what that means is that in a complete fiscal sponsorship, the fiscal sponsor's board of directors is actually responsible for making sure that the funds, the activities happen in the way that they were described and that they achieve a charitable purpose. Who's in charge in terms of legal responsibility? And I'm taking that beyond fiduciary responsibility to say, does the relationship mean that all contracts, for example, are signed by the fiscal sponsor? Depending upon the type of fiscal sponsorship relationship, will determine whether all legal responsibility sits with the fiscal sponsor or whether some of those responsibilities also sit with the fiscally sponsored project. In terms of strategy, what is the ultimate vision of the program and project? Strategy is a point that should always sit with the fiscally sponsored project and be a collaboration with the fiscal sponsor. But who's in charge should be the fiscally sponsored project. The programmatic work, another element. Also, there's a relationship there, but the power should sit with the fiscally sponsored project as to how the work actually happens. So as you are approaching a fiscal sponsor relationship, to really think about these different elements of who is in charge and to think about what that means for the work that you do in whatever the activity is of your program. And so the key here is that you really can negotiate. This is why there are different models of fiscal sponsorship. You can negotiate some elements of who's in charge. And so to be aware of that as you're entering into a fiscal sponsorship relationship. Next slide. Okay. So we've been talking about models, and this came up significantly on the last session of the 6 models of fiscal sponsorship that come from a resource that we'll share on the screen shortly and in the chat box from Colvin. It's a book that's called um, Six Models or Ways of Fiscal Sponsorship. And it highlights different ways to have a fiscal sponsorship relationship. So Barbara is going to talk now about what those different models are and why it's important to think about the type of model of fiscal sponsorship that you want as a grad.
Good evening, everybody. Let me just say a few quick words about the models, about several of the models. The whole process of fiscal sponsorship has been evolving over a period of years. And as we've heard from Kirsten and Dorcas, it's possible to negotiate an arrangement. And yet there are these big markers along a spectrum of who has what kind of control and responsibility. Let me just say that because all of these are the arrangements for the use of specially tax privileged money, donors and grant makers are getting tax benefits for making this money available for charitable purposes, for purposes that are good in the community. And that's a set of legal requirements that informs a lot of the choices of the fiscal sponsor organization, that we need to be properly aligned with the organizations that we're sponsoring, pardon me, in order to maintain their own 501c3 status with the federal government. So we've heard a lot about the comprehensive, the super duper relationship, in which a basic characteristic is that the project operates like it's a project of the sponsoring organization. The project organization does not have its own entity status, so it's not a legal person for purposes of contracting. So it's kind of, I don't know, Colvin would talk about it as an employer-employee kind of relationship, as opposed to a more completely collaborative relationship. But I don't mean this in the flow of the human relations. I mean this just in the sort of legal definition of the responsibilities. There are questions that the sponsor and sponsee are thinking about, like who's liable to third parties for bills and that kind of stuff. Is there a result and who owns that? So there's a whole series of legal questions all of which in the comprehensive arrangement run to the sponsor as the significant actor, except with respect to the functioning of the program. But when there's a question, the only legal entity around to answer and stand up for deliver on responsibilities is the board of directors of the sponsoring organization. And because the program that asks for fiscal sponsorship does not have that form of response. The independent contract model, model B on the slide that we showed, is much more like the project clearly belongs to the sponsor, and it has contracted with another group, which is a separate entity, in order to do the specific work. Another common arrangement is it's more common, I think, is the pre-approved grant relationship. So this can happen sometime when a grant maker or government wants to make a big grant to an organization and also wants to give that chunk of money to another existing 501c3, which will essentially function like the local grant maker. So it involves responding to the structure set up by the intermediate, the fiscal sponsor organization. So this is useful for an organization that exists but does not yet have its 501c3 and is still in the process of determining when and where to do that. I think Kirsten explained mentioned a technical assistance model where what can happen is that you are a 501c3, you have your own exemption, but you actually want to spend all your time doing your project and you really don't want to build out the organization's capacity to do bookkeeping, tax returns, payroll, all of that kind of back office stuff. So it is possible to hire, to contract with someone to be your fiscal sponsor who would provide those kinds of things. And in the model that we're discussing here, ideally assist you to develop those internal processes when it is you want them. Finally, there is a more, I don't know if someone else on the team wants to say more about an LLC model. It's increasingly common for organizations to do community work, to do excellent work in the form of a limited liability corporation instead of a corporation, which in Maryland is what you form in order to become a tax exempt organization. So that's a different kind of legal structure. It's easier to establish than a corporation. That has good things and bad things about it. But the relationship with the fiscal sponsor then is that in order to get the fiscally sponsored project to get the benefits of the sponsor's tax exempt status, the LLC is a wholly owned operation of the sponsoring organization. So you have a single member limited liability corporation, which is the project. And therefore you have tremendous control in the hands of the, very significant fiduciary and legal control in the hands of the fiscal sponsor. So that was, in the time that we have, a very quick rundown. Dorcas, Parag, you want to add some things?
No, just questions. So if folks have questions, because this came up quite a bit in the last session of 6 models, and just wanting to, are there particular questions around the models? Okay.
Okay.
All right. So now we're going to move to the next slide. which is really about the components that should be a part of a fiscal sponsor relationship. So
Sorry,
the first,
there was
yes,
a question from Paul. Oh, I'm sorry. Paulo had a question, but
I-
perhaps answering it in the Q&A section. So go ahead. I'm sorry about that.
great. Okay. And so we're going to move to the pieces that should be in writing. So that's the first thing is to, in the fiscal sponsorship relationship, to have an agreement. It doesn't have to be in a particular form, but having it in writing for all of the reasons that Kirsten talked about in terms of transparency and accountability. I'm going to turn this over to Parag to cover what then should be in the contract itself. Okay, I'll keep going. So in terms of thinking about the what is in writing, one of the key elements is to really be clear about the pieces that we just got finished talking about. What kind of model of fiscal sponsorship are we talking about? What is included in the relationship? What's not included in the relationship? As Barbara just described, a comprehensive fiscal sponsorship relationship looks very different than a relationship where the fiscal sponsor is providing technical assistance, right? Both of those things in this types of fiscal sponsorship are talked about as fiscal sponsorship, but they look very different. They mean very different things. And it's important to be clear on what is and what isn't included. Some of the key elements related to the contract are ownership. So as you develop materials, a curriculum, um, you have a logo. Who owns those things? And in a strong fiscal sponsorship relationship and in a contract where you have talked about these things, there's a process for transferring ownership from the fiscal sponsor to the fiscally sponsored project. And that the fiscal sponsor is really just holding ownership on behalf of, as opposed to actually owning it themselves. The money, it's a big category. How does it work? Reimbursements, cash advances, petty cash. How does the money come in? Is it coming into a separate account? And how does the money go out? What does that look like? Reporting, financial reporting, um, procedures, and any kind of changes in the finances, whether those changes are there's interest, good change, more money, or whether there is a shift in how things were accounted for. How does that get communicated? When does it get communicated? What's the life of the fiscal sponsorship relationship? Thinking about that on the front end. So the term of the agreement. So is this a 1-year agreement and relationship where we see how it's going to go and it renews? Does it renew automatically? And sometimes the fiscal sponsorship relationship is going to end. It's going to end because we become our own C3 and we no longer need the supports that the fiscal sponsor has provided. What does it look like to end the relationship? That being laid out. Reconciliation. So this is a piece where can run into some challenges, right? So how are the funds actually accounted for and reconciled on a regular basis? What does that look like? And then reconciliation in terms of conflict. So in any good relationship, that we should think about how we're going to resolve disputes before we have them. So what does that process look like, right? Is if you have a relationship for long enough, there are going to be some disputes, right? So how does that then get negotiated in the relationship, and thinking about and spelling that out up front. Next slide. Okay, so there are a range of resources. We're going to drop some in the chat. So there are links to all of these things. There are a number of books. The book that we have been referencing most is this one, which is about the 6 models of fiscal sponsorship. But the National Network of Fiscal Sponsors also has a resource page. And on their resource page, they have a range of questions for fiscal sponsors to think about, and for those who are looking for fiscal sponsors to consider in the relationship. So we'll add that to the chat and follow up with sending it out. But these are really good resources as you begin, continue, and end a fiscal sponsorship relationship. Next slide. So our plan was to do 2 groups. One group focused on beginning and ending the fiscal sponsorship relationship for all the reasons that we just talked about. Those questions are really similar. You start out right. You can continue and end right. So those sets of questions are similar. And then how to, as you're in a fiscal sponsorship relationship, make sure to get the most out of the relationship and to ensure that there is a good working relationship. So those are the 2 groups. And the we'll drop the link now for the 2 small groups, and we will move into those groups.
And just a quick sidebar. So for people who want to join us in the group discussion, so what's going to happen is in these there's 2 different messages in the chat box. And the first one is for group 1, the second one is for group 2. And depending on which group interests you, you just click on that link. And what will happen is you'll be exited out of the webinar and you'll go into a new Zoom meeting. And in that meeting, it will be a smaller group. We would do the breakout groups here through Zoom on the webinar, but apparently Zoom's funky like that. So we're just going to split everyone up into 2 groups. So take the time to just look at the messages in the chat box, decide which group you want to be in, and click on the link. It'll take you right to the group you want to be in. Also, just want to remind folks, in case Dorcas didn't mention it earlier, we do have a survey. And so please, at some point, because you will be sent this link when you finish tonight's webinar, just click on it. You can check out the survey. You click on it now, so you just have it open, and just make sure you fill it out to tell us if what was shared with you at the end of the seminar was useful. But again, the 2 different messages in the chat box, just look at the message, decide which one you want to be in, and it should open it up in Zoom for the smaller group.
And Adam, you'll advance the slide. So in group 1, these are the 2 critical questions. What should you think about at the beginning? And what should you talk about as you're ending a fiscal sponsorship relationship? And then in group 2, you'll advance the slide. What are the questions to ask when looking for a fiscal sponsor, and what should you talk about during the relationship to make sure it's working well, which are the questions that were in the chat as well. So thank you all. And for those who are joining us in the small groups, we look forward to seeing you shortly.